Welcome to Gita Wisdom. I'm your host, Joshua Greene.
Well, welcome one and all. Just by final announcement, this is our last interview of the summer, our last program for we're having a summer recess. We're going to resume in the fall. Again, if you wish to revisit some of the Gita Wisdom podcasts over the last many years, you're welcome to go to gitawisdom.org and click on podcasts, I would imagine. Is that right? Yep, there you go. We have a wonderful program for you this evening. Ravi Gupta is a dear friend, a colleague in the field of bhakti studies, but I think rather than attempting to do an imperfect job of introducing someone with a very illustrious resume, Ravi, let me invite you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about your personal history and some of the issues and themes of your very compelling career.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm really delighted to be here. I consider it particularly an honor to be here for the grand finale, I guess, of this season. So I hope it doesn't turn out to be a dud for those who are looking forward to fireworks at the very end of your season.
No chance of that.
But yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Let's see, I think the right way to tell you about myself would be my beginnings in Boise, Idaho. And for those of you not from this part of the country, Boise is a little town capital of Idaho. It's not so little anymore. Idaho and Utah have the fastest growing populations in the country, actually, according to the latest census. And but at the time when my parents moved there, I was 4 years old, and we were the only Hindu families in town, the only Vaishnav families in town. And that meant that I spent much of my childhood explaining to others who I am, what I practice, what I believe in. And we'd get invited to just about every cultural event that took place in our city, whether it was the Thanksgiving Interfaith Service, or the dedication of the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, or it was some sort of media discussion on current issues. We would be there, and we'd be the Hindu family that they'd roll out, and you know, we'd do our spiel, and I think that's part of what led me to becoming a professor, because I just grew up always trying to explain who I was and trying to contextualize myself and my understanding, my background, in a way that would make sense to an audience that typically knew nothing about me or my background. And sort of living between these cultures of India and the United States, having been born and raised in this country, but deeply connected to my parents' roots in India. I think I mean, in hindsight, of course, at that point, I didn't know all this, but in hindsight, looking back, I think that just kind of set me up to be a professor in the classroom, because that's what teachers do, at least in the university. And especially if you're teaching the humanities, and especially if you're teaching religious studies, the way I do at Utah State University, is that we whether you like it or not, a teacher brings himself or herself into the classroom. Even though you're talking about this over here, students also know that it's about you, and your presence and what you bring with you is crucial. And along with that, then you invite the students to bring themselves, their entire selves, into the classroom. And that's what makes teaching such a joyful activity, and such a difficult one as well, especially when it comes to matters of religion. So I mean, I think that gets to the heart of it, which is that a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues, I shouldn't say a lot, some of my colleagues around the country come into academia primarily for the intellectual stimulation and the research that's involved. And teaching, sadly, becomes an unnecessary burden that goes with it. For me and for many of my colleagues, it's very different in that I love my research. I love the intellectual creativity that comes with being a professor, but my heart is in the classroom as a teacher, being with my students, and just whether it's opening up a world for them to see kind of the 30,000 feet high viewpoint, or whether it's diving deep into a subject and getting really up and close to it, just the ability to help your students through that journey is infinitely rewarding. It's really wonderful. And that's kind of where my heart has been. And I think my academic record shows that. I've taught I got my PhD in Oxford University in England, and then came back to the United States and taught first at University of Florida, then at Centre College in Kentucky, a small liberal arts college, then at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, a less small liberal arts public university, and then here at Utah State University. And in the course of those journeys, I've encountered a variety of different students from different backgrounds, adopted different teaching methods, garnered 4 different teaching awards at each of these institutions where I taught, a couple of book awards and research fellowships around the way. So it's been a good journey, and it's not over. I'm looking forward to continuing to learn more and experience more, and hopefully contribute more as the years go on.
Oh, what a beautiful introduction. And you were in the right place. I mean, I know a lot of the people who were with us this evening, and they bring their best game to these gatherings. So when you talk about students who invest themselves in their learning, you're with the right group here this evening. They're going to have a lot of questions for you. I'm going to go off script here for a minute, because that introduction made me very curious to ask you whether, in addition to all the invitations to these programs, as you know, I guess the token Hindu family in town, did you also encounter bias, prejudice, racial discrimination? I mean, have you been the object of people's scorn or derision, or has it all been very friendly and lovely?
So I mean, that's a good question. I must say that Boise, growing up, was a place that was really hungry for cultural diversity, and as a result, we were welcomed with open arms most places we went. I mean, there was the occasional unsuspecting or unknowing comment, ignorant comment that people would make, but nothing, powerfully memorable in my mind. I think the greatest, if we're just talk about bias, I think the greatest memory that I have, if we can head in that direction, would be to say that there was always an experience of being a guest at the table. And considering the fact that our hosts were such wonderful people, that was a lovely experience. And yet at some point growing up, it became clear that I would always remain a guest. And there's something unsettling about that when you would like to be a member of the family and you would like to be not a guest, but a resident. And so that sense of kind of the exotic foreigner is something that in my teaching, I try to really help students move beyond. I think that's one of the biggest challenges to when they study Hinduism or religions different than themselves, is to look at that other and then think of them as the exotic other. And that can take 2 sides. Either everything about them is just beautiful and gorgeous because they're exotic and they're foreign and they're from India and it's the Orient, right? And that whole idea of Orientalism, or it's the other side where the exotic foreigner is someone who's a pagan or a heathen or primitive and therefore in need of civilization and in need of education, which brings with it the sour taste of colonialism. So you've got these opposites that the exotic foreigner inhabits. And one of the things that I try to accomplish in the classroom is to really say, let's move beyond that. Let's recognize the fact that that exotic foreigner is actually a whole lot more normal and similar to who you are than you perhaps realize. And they struggle with the same human strengths and failings that we all struggle with. And so bringing things down to earth and de-exoticizing, that's a big part of what I do in the classroom when I teach. And again, I'm part of that. In other words, I've experienced that. I know what it's like, and I know that it's a good starting point. I mean, there's much worse starting points. It's a good starting point, but it's definitely not the best end point. And so we want to keep learning and growing from that.
Well, I mean, this is an unexpected beginning direction for our discussion, but I can't resist pursuing this just a little bit. I mean, why, in your opinion, and this is something you know both from an academic perspective as well as a personal perspective, why is the other so threatening? What is it about confronting someone who's not like us that people find? I remember the television coverage of the rioters on January 6th storming the Capitol building, and there was at least one guy who had a sweatshirt with the words Camp Auschwitz printed on it with a death head insignia below. You know, racism and anti-Semitism are alive and growing in this country. And they're at the heart of all the bitterness and the violence and the sadness that we've been seeing for many, many months now. You're a professor. You're supposed to know this stuff. Why do we have such difficulty we collectively being comfortable with the other?
Yeah, that's such a deep question. And there are so many answers or ways of attempting to answer that question. I'll just say one thing that comes to mind right away, and is something that is a product of my experience as a teacher and as a person in this part of the country, which is to say, in many ways, I think the most frightening thing we encounter is ourselves. And the other is essentially a mirror held up in which we see ourselves. And when we look at the other, we sometimes see someone who's very different than we are. And that shows us who we are not, who we could be, perhaps, who we do not want to be like. But one way or the other, I think we're learning something about ourselves. We're being forced to see ourselves in a way that we've not seen before. We're encountering ourselves, and that's scary. Other times we see someone, the other, as someone who's as someone who's reasonable, and as someone who's human and perhaps cares about things and is passionate about things just as we are. And reasonability in the other is also sometimes a very frightening thing to meet. I know when I present, I teach a world religions class, and we go through a variety of different religious traditions: Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, Christianity, and I try to teach each tradition as if it were my own. I try to present it in a way that the person learning about it sees why that religion works. It has worked for thousands of years. These are all living traditions that continue to tick. And why do they tick? Why do they work? I try to convey that to my students, but it's surprising the reactions you get from that. For some, it's a moment of, bliss, it's joy, it's ecstasy to see the fact that there's such goodness and some darkness in other traditions, but humanness, that it's real either way. And for others, it's scary, it's frightening to see how another worldview that is so different from their own could be so reasonable. And initially, when I started teaching, that was an odd thing. I thought, how could someone be threatened by reasonability? How could someone be threatened by the fact that something makes sense? And yet the idea that someone is different and yet makes sense reveals something about ourselves that perhaps doesn't make sense, that perhaps is an alternative to how we might think, that forces us to break open from our own limited viewpoint. And that's what's frightening. So I think in a paradoxical way, what's scary about the other is that we meet ourselves in the process.
You put me in mind of a dinner I was invited to attend a few years back. It was at the home of a rather well-known scientist and his family. And I was seated coincidentally next to his young son. And when his son asked me, he said, "What do you do?" I said, you know, I'm in the religions department at the university. And he got an expression on his face that I almost got worried that he was having some kind of physical attack of some kind. He went pale. And it took me a moment to realize that I needed to change the wording that I was using to explain myself to him, because here was a young boy who had grown up in an environment of complete physicalist orientation, that for him and his sister, he was in an environment where his father and all of the people he was meeting had zero interest in religion. In fact, religion was being depicted as something negative, something quite to be avoided, something dangerous. You know, it's the domain of people who can't really confront life in a healthy way. They need a crutch of some kind. They're unable to deal with the realities, the existential realities of the world. So I quickly double backed and said, I don't mean by that I'm religious. I teach religious studies. And he looked at me and went, "Oh," as though that was okay. And I'm wondering whether some of the reaction that you might have been experiencing growing up, obviously from a different kind of background. You're not a normal American, right? You're from something else, and it's probably Hindu. And that represents this whole worldview, you know, something that a people who embrace mythology as real. You know, I wonder even on some unconscious plane where they're seeing someone, a brown or black skinned person, doesn't almost involuntarily raise the specter of religious dogma, you know, of something threatening. Does that ring any bells for you, or am I kind of just imagining that?
No, I mean, definitely that rings a lot of bells. I make that move that you made at that dinner. I make that move, numberless times in terms of different situations. I often make the move before I see the pale face in order to kind of reassure people that I'm not here to convert them, to convince them, to baptize them at this very moment, that their conversations about religion don't have to be necessarily promoting a religion, that religious studies the shortcomings of religion and looks at it from a critical lens, just as it would any other human endeavor. So being able to kind of make that distinction, which is, I think, part of the reason our departments are often called religious studies rather than departments of religion. It betrays that insecurity about this is not about religion, right? You don't get departments of political studies. You get departments of political science or politics. You don't get departments of literature studies. You get departments of literature. Right. Or English studies. You get departments of English. But with religion, it's religious studies to detach the the scholar and the teacher from what it is they're teaching.
Right. You can come to this class and you can be safe. You don't have to worry. We're just studying this.
Exactly. Exactly. And yet I think what people realize soon after entering the classroom is that it is a deeply personal engagement. Any subject is. It's not that because it's religion it is, but you can't go into a political science classroom or you can't go into an English literature classroom without bringing yourself into that classroom and engaging who you are. People study religion from a comparative lens, whether they like it or not, right? The mind is always comparing to categories that you already have and trying to place things there. But then the other thing that I also try to, and I think this gets to our topic or our theme, which is I try to remind people that when religious people speak of myth, when religious studies scholars speak of myth, myth is not a synonym for falsity. It's not a synonym for something that is non-factual. That myth carries with it something, that word, scholars use that word in a very different way than it's used on the street, where myth is something that is in fact true, maybe even truer than reality, because it bears a deep truth that has manifested in reality in multiple ways, often across large periods of time, sometimes across multiple cultures as well. And so when we speak of myth, we speak of something that is very deeply true rather than superficially false.
That's a fascinating distinction. Let me just remind our guests here this evening that they are welcome to post questions in the chat box. We're going to open this up to Q&A in a little while, and at that point, you will be invited to unmute your microphone and ask your question directly of our guest, Ravi Gupta. But if you wish, if there are things coming up for you already, you're welcome to post that in the chat box, and we'll get to your questions in just a few minutes. I want to, if I may, Ravi, use this as a good bridge into our announced topic, which is the past as present. Can you give us a sense of what you mean when you talk about the past as present? What is that referring to?
Yeah, so that title for the talk comes from a particular understanding of time that we find in, I would say, Indic traditions more broadly, but Hinduism, Vaishnavism in particular, which is thinking of time not necessarily as linear, not necessarily as moving in a single direction, moving towards a destination, but rather time as repeating itself, as looping around. And I don't like always to say circular, because that sounds like it's pointless or that it's not going anywhere. To go in circles is an expression that we use for someone who's lost their way and who has no destination in mind. So often I think it's nice to think of time as moving in spirals, where in a spiral, one might move through time, an individual moves through time, often coming over the same experiences over and over again, as you rotate around that central point, and yet each time a little bit higher and higher, hopefully, if not downward, which would be unfortunate, but moving upward and learning from those experiences and growing in our path towards liberation or salvation or self-actualization. And so the past as present essentially says we live in the past today, not in the frustrating sense of not being able to move on, but that the past is very much present with us today. Who we are is perhaps not that different from where we've been. And as we move further, we will still come across those lessons and those experiences of the past again and again and again, but from a higher perspective, from a broader understanding of things. And so thinking of time in that way, as cyclical, as circular, as spiral, that's what I meant by past as present.
I mean, it's made me very thoughtful ever since you proposed that topic for our discussion this evening, because I've had to make the distinction in my own mind between myself as I perceive myself from a spiritual perspective as someone who does not change with time. You know, the Atman, the consciousness, the undying self, the self that is not born, that does not die, that is not affected by time. That me, whom I'm hopefully moving toward knowing better, the more I attempt to perfect my daily practices and my studies and so on. And the me who comes into being with this body and who ends with death. I mean, I guess I dwell a little bit too much on it, but it's still very real and very palpable for me as my mother's death 6-7 months ago, and how much of myself was invested in growing up with her as we did, she a single parent, me her only child, and identifying so very clearly with the circumstances of my youth and my childhood and off till the time I'd gone off to college. You know, I really do see myself as a particular person. That person I see in the way you're describing it as someone who is moving through time. You know, that part of life is over, you know, and it's almost this very painful sense of loss because she's not there anymore. That part of my life, which was a fun time. I had a wonderful childhood. So that's gone. And questioning who is this person that has emerged from that? So when you talk about this with your students, do you make the distinction between the self who is not affected by time and the self traveling through time, or do you see some equivalence there?
At the risk of generalizing, which professors and scholars really hesitate to do, as you well know. But let me say that I think what you've just described, Joshua, is one of the key quandaries of wisdom traditions across the world is how do we bring together our personal sense, our conviction, our individual conviction that there is something stable about me, that I exist and I persist much beyond the confines that this mortal frame allows me to exist in. And on the other hand, how do I honor and celebrate and live with the fact that this mortal frame, this changing physical frame that I have is still important and it's dear to me, and others connected to it are dear to me, and I have responsibilities connected to them, and joys and pain and suffering. That tension, that quandary, to honor both of those aspects that we intuitively as human beings recognize. More or less every religious tradition I know has some sense of persistence after death and existence before death. And the same religious traditions attempt to honor the present and the physical body and our connections there. How do we bring those two together? And I think this is one of the great questions that the Gita poses. In particular, is to say, with that question of dharma, is to ask, how do we tie the present with eternity? How do we tie temporality with eternity? How do we make sense of the fact that I'm living these two identities? And some traditions have attempted to really boil one down to the other. So certain Buddhist traditions, for example, will argue against certain scientific viewpoints, will argue against persistence after death. And others have taken a very idealistic sort of approach and said, it's just the eternal self, and everything around that's physical is not real. It's not something that is worthy of holding on to in any sense. But the Gita really tries to hold these two together and say that dharma is that bridge which takes our relationships and our connections and our affections and our joys and pleasures and sufferings in this world, in this life, and offers it, connects it to something that's persistent and gives it eternal meaning. So that when dharma is pursued every moment in the right way, with the right mood, for the right purpose, that dharma, even though it's done right now in relation to my mother, to my father, to my children, to my wife, that dharma has eternal consequences for who I am as a real person, as an individual person. So that tension that you just described, that goes, I think, to the heart of the Gita's teaching, is how do we bring those two together and live with that without reducing one to the other, or without rejecting one in favor of the other.
I'm pretty sure all of our guests this evening are familiar with what you refer to when you talk of the Gita, but just to be safe, in case we have any new guests with us, you're speaking about the Bhagavad-Gita, which is, of course, the quintessential wisdom text of India and the condensed knowledge and insights of the extended library of the Sanskrit texts. Just to make a complicated challenge even more complicated, I sometimes play with this other meta-narrative, which is that my orientation into the Krishna Bhakti tradition has a certain point of origin historically within this world. What was that self prior to that moment historically? In other words, if I'm identifying my eternal self in terms and vocabulary and concepts that emerge from a tradition which has its roots in history, how do I now envision myself prior to that point of origin? And what happens when the future unfolds in a way that, look, at this point, we don't know how much longer the world has to exist, the way we're treating the environment and so on. So it's kind of the Russian nesting dolls, you know, one within the other, or these many different selves. I'm not going to ask you to answer that, but I would like to open this up. So if anyone in our little family viewing ship here this evening would like, you're welcome to unmute your phone at any point and chime in with questions or comments of your own. What is the next step for you? Where do you see yourself going with this? I mean, you've had a rather distinguished career already for such a young man. Do you envision yourself taking your perspectives on the Bhakti tradition and the Bhagavad-Gita into a particular penetration into academia? Where do you see yourself going in the next few years?
So that's a question I've been asking myself recently. I've finished a book that I co-authored with Kenneth Valpey for Columbia University Press on the Bhagavata Purana, which is one of the three major Sanskrit texts that have shaped classical India, classical Hinduism, Vaishnavism in particular, the Krishna Bhakti traditions, and just a beautiful, beautiful work. And we've finished an abridged translation of this text. It's called Bhagavata Purana Selected Readings. And with that project, it was actually the two books that go together, a book of translations and then a book of articles that plumb the depths of this work in different ways. With the conclusion of that, the question for me was, okay, where do we head next, and what do I do, and how do I best express my scholarship and teaching? And I think after all of these years, it's been now 15 years of full-time teaching and writing, I think where I want to go is in a direction where I put more of myself into my writing. And what I mean by that is that I want to address questions where I think I have something to contribute to our world's predicament today, and also in terms of what the Krishna Bhakti traditions that I study and that I practice have to contribute to. So as a scholar of the Krishna Bhakti traditions, but also as someone who lives them, I want to bring more of my identity as a lived practitioner into my writing. And the theme that keeps emerging front and center, and I think you'll appreciate this, Joshua, given what you've written before as well, is to think through what it means to be an engaged Vaishnava, to be engaged in our world. And how can the Vaishnava traditions, how can the Bhakti traditions offer perspectives that are useful in the ongoing conversations that we have about the future of our world? The ecology and environment is one of the major areas that concerns me now, about which I've started to do some writing and publishing in this area. But the more I read about these subjects and the way they're discussed in the United States, it's clear to me that perspectives from afar can be very useful in changing the nature of the discussion and offering perspectives that can actually help in finding real solutions. So looking at things from that sort of engaged perspective, that's where I want to go. And I'm being especially nebulous about it because I'm not quite sure exactly what shape that's going to take, other than the fact that I want my writing to be engaged in a way that I've hesitated to do, that I've kept a distance from up to this point in my writing.
You know, you compel me to ask you something that's a little awkward, but I'm going to do it anyway because, you know, I love making people feel awkward. Namely, does it really matter? You know, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, how much of ourselves should we realistically be expected to invest in protecting the future? I mean, you picked the theme of the past as present. Well, what about the present as future? I mean, how much are we responsible for what the world's going to look like in 100 years or 200 years or 300 years? And what should it matter? I mean, are we really obligated by being a citizen of the world to sacrifice our own comforts and the short amount of time we have in this life to be thinking about people we're never going to know in the future, who, for all we know, there may not even be a world for them to live in some better way that we might help bring about, just as the world we live in today is the product of the efforts of who knows how many millions of people from centuries gone by who didn't know us. You know, we were some abstraction in their future, and they're some abstraction in our past. And you know, shouldn't people be left alone to just deal with today? You know, I've got children who I'm worried about, or I've got bills that I have to pay. And, you know, I'd like to, after a year of seclusion and anxiety, I'd like to get back to having a bit of a normal life again and socializing and so on. Why this compulsion to get people to think about some bigger abstract responsibility toward a future that we might likely never even have a part in.
The best way to deal with the present, to deal with whatever comes our way now, is to put it in a broader vision of the past and the future. That's who we are as human beings. Anthropologists have spoken about a healthy society has 4 components to it: ancestors, elders, adults, and children, right? And why? Why care about ancestors? Why care about children or grandchildren? The Vedic tradition, broadly speaking, says a person is happy when they can say that they've seen 7 generations. And 3 in the past, my own, and 3 in the future is often how that's counted. Now, why? It's not just because we've got a responsibility towards our great-grandkids or to our great-grandparents, but because that's what it means to be healthy and to be happy. That's what gives our blip of a life more significance, is when we have a sense of being connected to our ancestors, when we have a sense of being connected to our great-grandchildren. So even if we take the argument or the line of reasoning that you're taking us along, that, why should it matter? Why can't we just be left alone to deal with our lives? The answer is the best way to deal with our lives is to tie it in to that broader past and that broader future that we have not known, that we will not know, and that yet is part of us. And that's where that spiral, I think, comes back and is so very important to recognize. We're not talking about something other. We're talking about right here. We've been there. We've done that. We will be doing that again. It's the past is right here with us in a very real way. This is not some abstract metaphysical idea at all, but this is how cultures and societies the world over give meaning to their present day existence and get it to mean more than merely a blip in a world history where we would mean nothing if it were not for the fact that we are connected to our past and we care about our future.
Wow, that's very provocative. I think you've really done a beautiful job there of navigating a rather tricky question. I thank you for that. I see that Athena has her hand up. Go ahead. You're welcome to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Hare Krishna, Dandavat Pranams, Ravi Gupta. I loved your talks, Radhika Ramana Prabhu. So I was very excited to see that you are invited to speak. And this is for sure the fireworks for the last session before the summer recess. I actually have 3 questions, if that's all right. And this relates to what piqued my interest is the fact that you teach a world religions class. And for me personally, I follow Bhakti Yoga, but I personally am a champion for interfaith because of my personal experiences. I won't get into it, but how you even came into Bhakti and had the even taste to take to any sort of spirituality or religion came from being in contact with a pure devotee, but in a different path. And this person had never once told me to follow, say, Christianity or any of the Abrahamic religions, but having so much influence of this person has just even allowed me to take to a spiritual path. And I personally am, so my first question is, I'm sure you've thought about it, and as a scholar in these world religions, I was curious if you personally believe that, in essence, the Abrahamic religions, those who follow it, are bhakti yogis. And the reason why I say that is because, and I personally am say, gathering my own pramana to prove that actually they are Bhagavan worshippers or followers. While they might not have all the details of the personal form, they believe God has relationships. He reciprocates. He has qualities, has personality, has emotions, which all point to Bhagavan. Because if we even take in the bhakti schema, say the three aspects of God, while they might not know the personal form, just that God has a form, the fact that God reciprocates, has leelas, all of that points to a Bhagavan form. And I'd love for you to comment if you personally thought about that. I'm sure you have, and even some evidence. Two is
my memory is it flickers, and I might not be able to hold on to the others. May I answer this first, and then we can? Would that be okay?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question and for sharing your personal experience. Let me answer by sharing an experience of mine. I think that'll answer your question pretty well. In the course of teaching at Utah State University, one of my students. Well, let me start by saying this. For years, we had a campus preacher who would be on campus and in the quad with a table of books and the Bible and asking people. He was a very thoughtful person, and he would put up a question every day, a question for the day, very thoughtful question, invite students to come and talk to him about that question. And people would stop and he would preach, and he's 7 years as a preacher there. And eventually he decided he wanted to study Christian theology and in a seminary, become trained in that area. So he started to take undergraduate courses at the university, majoring in religion, and found himself in my world religions course, and then my introduction to Hinduism course. And he'd come by to my office and we'd talk about a lot of wonderful questions, both about lived experience, him as an evangelical and me as a Vaishnava, and about theological ideas, philosophical ones. And as that happened, it started to become more consistent, and we'd schedule times. And I must say that he's gone on to graduate school at an evangelical seminary and doing exceptionally well as a student, as he always did. And but we've continued our conversations over Zoom. And I must say that they are some of the most deeply nourishing conversations that I have with someone of deep faith and openness, and my own stereotypes about the evangelical tradition that were born from, common American experiences, I would say. My own stereotypes really becoming shattered and growing into understanding a tradition that I had dismissed as not worthy of dialogue. I had done in a lot of interfaith dialogue. I mean, throughout my life, really from childhood, with Catholics and various denominations of Protestants and Buddhists and all sorts of traditions. But here was someone, the campus preacher, that I thought I would never have a meaningful conversation with because of my own stereotypes, because of my own shortcomings in understanding the evangelical tradition. And yet, evangelicalism is a tradition that has deep roots, that has very thoughtful theologians, it has lived experience. And I was able to share that. And we have really delightful, meaningful conversations that are some of the most nourishing spiritual conversations that I have. And I'm proud to say it's with someone who is an evangelical, who is not of my tradition, who I didn't think it was possible to have a dialogue with. So yes, that truth, that reality, that sincerity of bhakti is present in every tradition that I have encountered, that I have learned or I have taught. One only has to look with a sincere heart. And when you encounter someone who is also sufficiently mature in their own practice to recognize that in your tradition, a dialogue can take place. Where I hesitate, though, Athena, is that I hesitate in taking categories, terminology, and ways, structures of thinking from my own tradition and trying to fit another's tradition into those categories. I understand the urge from the perspective of the practitioner who's trying to reach out in dialogue. That attempt to see another's tradition in terms of your own categories and your own terminology can seem very generous, can seem very benign. But we have to be very careful with that because it can feel downright threatening to the other person, right? Or at least jarring, if not threatening. So a Christian attempting to find the Trinity in Hinduism, because the Trinity is present everywhere, right? So there you have the Hindu Trinity as the British colonialists attempted to find and the British educated Hindus facilitated. It's problematic, it's jarring, it's why ought I look for a Trinity in but the presence of God in a form as someone who descends to earth as an incarnation. Sure, there are resonances, there are parallels that we can find to Jesus within the Vaishnava traditions. And vice versa, me attempting to find the categories of Vaishnava tradition, Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan, in another practice, in another person's practice, I'm very careful about doing that kind of thing because you end up blurring over a lot of distinctions and differences that are very important for that tradition. And that person doesn't necessarily want to exist within those categories. So that's my response, kind of yes and no at the same time, an affirmative and a hesitation together, if that makes any sense.
Athena, just before you go on to your next question, I see Bob Cohen has his hand raised. Let me ask him to come in and then I'll come back to you, if that's okay.
Yes, excuse me, I'm in my car, but always enjoy the both of you. So thank you. My question is this. From my many years of experience working with religious studies department, I see a hesitation for the departments to discuss religious issues such as ontology. Rather, they often go down. I was just at a program yesterday at local university, and it turns into anthropology, in which the main topic is, well, the Hindus eat this food and the other people eat that food, and comparing and contrasting. But to get to the deeper issues, often religious studies departments don't do that. So my double question is that your experience? And do you try to get beyond that?
So what you just described, Bob, is really kind of the heart of what religious studies is. One of the things that religious studies does explicitly, consciously, is say, we're going to bracket, set aside, that means truth claims, and claims of identity, and try not to adjudicate those truth claims. That those truth claims, is there a God? What is the nature of that deity? How are we related to that deity? All we will do is describe and analyze and perhaps compare those ideas without attempting to answer questions of truth. And that's done very consciously. And so what religious studies actually studies is not God or truth, but human beings, right? And this is a crucial distinction. Religious studies is a humanistic discipline that studies human beings' behavior and beliefs when they claim to being religious, right? And so because they're studying human beings, well, they use anthropology, they use sociology, they use, history, they use philosophy, etc. Where you start getting into truth claims and questions of that is more in the realm of theology. And in discussing theology, now we're in the realm where you take history, you take philosophy, you take anthropology, but you use them to ask questions of what is truth, how do I understand the world, and how do I live in the world in a truthful and wholesome manner? What is the human good that I can experience? Those are questions of theology. So religious studies, I mean, what you describe about religious studies is true. That is religious studies' greatest strength. It is also its greatest weakness, right? People come to religious studies classes hoping to find the truth and often leave disappointed, hoping to help in their journey, and they often leave disappointed. And others come to religious studies classes particularly because they want to stay away from questions of truth. They want to figure out, what is this thing called religion, which gives us some of the greatest joys and most painful experiences in human history? And those people study it from a human perspective, right? So that's religious studies' strength. It's also its greatest weakness, we might say, or something that it stays away from quite explicitly. So that what you experience, all I can say is to affirm that and say, I mean, that is the nature of the beast.
Thank you. That was a helpful answer. Thanks a lot.
We have other hands, but Athena, I promised you we would come back. Let me ask you to choose one of your two remaining questions so that we leave a little time for some of our other guests. So go ahead and ask one more question of Ravi, and then we'll move to some of our other participants.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. If I get there, 2 quarters shorter questions, so they're almost tied. So essentially, I think it could be one question. Ravi, I appreciate your stating trying not to fit paradigms to other ones, because I recognize that it could be not completely accurate. And in one sense, trying to fit what we believe into their faith, which might not be completely, I guess, also proper. I guess my question is, how have you reconciled? And maybe you just say it's a chinta, or it's different universes, the different time periods of the theology. For example, Christians believe, say Adam was created from dust, and then Adam's the first created being, and we could say, well, that's like Brahman, and everything, the Manus, and then all things comes out. And that's, again, applying our theology to theirs to try to explain. And we can so ignorantly say, well, theirs is just an analogy. It's an allegory. And so many times, because we feel like maybe we have more knowledge or just information to say, oh, well, theirs is a watered down explanation, but the essence is all the same. But when, and I'm also careful to try, I'm aware, say, not commenting too much on other religions, because I'm not well read in it. I am not an authority in it. But when you do talk to, I'm sure when, for example, you have conversations with those in following other faiths, when, for example, I ask, do you actually believe, say, Adam and Eve are the first created beings, or is it really like an allegory, just to simplify the essence that, say, we fell or we've sinned? And they will say, for example, no, we can trace back, just like for us in the Bhagavad-Gita, the preface there is from Srila Prabhupada all the way back to Parampara, back to Krishna, to prove that Lord Chaitanya existed, Krishna existed, it is all real. They similarly say, no, we can trace back today all the way back to Adam. So it is real. And that, in one sense, that's their pramana. And then we go, well, how is that even possible? That's two very different paradigms in one sense, or even explanations. So when, in one sense, I agree that the essence is all the same. Love God with all your body, heart, mind, and soul among all these religions. Yet the details, which you can argue, is it true, is it really important or not, seem to differ widely, which may contradict our philosophy, and similarly our philosophy might contradict their philosophy. And if we believe these are all bona fide paths and what they say is actually truth, how do we reconcile that? Like,
I think actually, Ravi, Athena's managed to put her finger on one of the grand questions of all time. Which, how do we reconcile relative perspectives on something that's supposed to be absolute? And it's what leads, I think, a lot of rational thinking people to say, you know what, it's all a bunch of hooey.
Yeah, so let me make two comments. That question has many aspects to it, but I'll I try to keep my response short and say two things. One is that I speak here now as a practicing Vaishnava, as a Krishna Bhakta, and to say that there's two things that my tradition offers, I think, that are useful in the way that I approach other traditions, right? Two things that really that are the cornerstones of how I approach and appreciate another's tradition. One is that in matters of ultimacy, we expect multiplicity. And what I mean by that is that sometimes one scholar has called this a monotheism of consciousness. Sometimes we can take a perspective that the more important something is, the less of it there must be. And in ultimate things, there should be only one. Vaishnava traditions take a very different perspective on it by saying the more important something is, the more of it there is going to be. So when we speak of ultimate things, we can expect there to be a limitless variety of things present there. So when we speak of sacred texts or holy books, those we're talking of books that are ultimate books. These aren't period pieces for the 18th century. They aren't telephone directories. We're talking about, books that deal with the great questions of the world. We can expect there to be more than one of such works. And that's why the Vaishnava scriptural canon is vast. It consists of many, many works, and it continues to be open. It continues to grow, that canon. It's not closed. When it comes to talking about God, God is the ultimate being. We can expect that God, even if he is one, takes multiple, limitless forms, that there's a polymorphic monotheism, one God who takes multiple forms. And when it comes to different ways of approaching that deity, we can expect multiple paths to be present as well. In fact, every chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita is named after a yoga, a way of connecting the individual with the supreme, right? So the more important something is, the more of it there must be. And therefore, if there is a truth that I hold dear, I expect to find that truth elsewhere, outside my own tradition. And when I do find that truth elsewhere, that confirms, that solidifies my faith in my own tradition, because now I know that it must be true. It must be sat. Sat is that which exists, that's present everywhere, not just for a moment, not just for one tradition, but it's present everywhere. And so that conviction then grows. And if I were to find a truth that is exclusively my own, I would worry. I would worry, is it true? Because why do I not see it in other forms, in other places, right? So the more, the greater something is, the more of it we expect. That's one principle that I have tried to live by in addressing multiplicity and to addressing diversity.
Ravi, I have to tell you something. I'm not easily surprised. You've just surprised the heck out of me. That was a brilliant answer. I mean, there's a lot to chew on there. The idea that ultimate issues almost demand expansive responses. How can you limit something so important to one narrow perspective? And in a sense, it extends even past the fields of religion. Now you've opened the door to a reconciling of non-theistic perspectives on truth, because truth demands it. Truth demands that there must be these various perspectives. My gosh, that's our show, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming, and send your cards and letters to Ravi Gupta. That was wonderful. Goodness gracious. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box. Athena, thank you. You've broadened our horizons here with your questions. The concept of time in the Gita past, present, future, is understood by the successful practitioner. Do any other traditions have a similar understanding? Wow, that's a challenging question. Is the question clear to you?
I think so. I mean, on a just a empirical level, I would say, in general, the concepts of time, as they're described in the Gita, are shared, broadly speaking, in the Indic traditions. So Buddhism would have a similar understanding of the way time works, Sikhism and Jainism as well. The dharmic traditions, we might say, share certain parallels in terms of how time is understood. But I'd like to just say one thing a little bit deeper than just the empirical fact of kind of comparative religion, which is to say that the idea that I think one of the most important elements of how I see time as a Vaishnava, and I think the Bhagavad-Gita understands the way time works, is that time and history are not necessarily going anywhere. There is no destination for history, no end times, no apocalypse, no moment where everything comes to a conclusion, and history itself is not expressing the will of God in some grand fashion. Rather, in the Indic traditions, we might say broadly, again, I'm generalizing, which is always a risk, but to say that time is like a river, and both God and human beings dip into that river for their bath and eventually dip out of it as well. And the river continues to flow. And not only does it flow, but it flows in a cycle where that river ends up in the ocean, is evaporated by clouds, poured back on land, and again onto mountains as snow, melts into rivers, and moves its way through the ocean. And that river of time, because of its circular nature, my faith as a Vaishnava does not stand or fall based on a notion of historical fact, right? And by that, I mean, this goes back to a question, Joshua, that you raised earlier about the historicity of the Krishna Bhakti tradition as arising in a moment of time. And Athena raised as well, that I wanted to mention in response to her question, which is that history, as it's moving, because it's not moving in some massive direction to a grand end, therefore, trying to locate elements of faith in a particular moment of historical time, of geographical location, etc., are not a linchpin upon which my faith stands or falls. For other traditions, that may be the case, but not for the Vaishnava traditions in general. Now, this is not to say that Vaishnavas or Hindus think of their sacred texts and the accounts described there as being merely allegory. Some might, but the majority don't. They don't see it as merely allegorical texts that have moral lessons for human beings. They do see them as real, as factual, as having happened. But if we are not able to dig in the ground and find physical evidence for it, if we're not able to locate the exact moment at which it happened or it rose, that's okay. That's not where that faith rests. It's not in history that faith rests, or in a very narrow sense of historical fact, but in the reality that within the circle of time, these things are in essence always real. They're always there with us because it's a cycle. We're always in that river of time, whether you're in the ocean or in the sky or in the river on the ground. It's always present.
All right, I got to challenge you here. I don't live in that transcendent place. I might like to, but I'm a creature of my environment. I'm a product of this life. The only sense of identity that I actually have is the one that I can track with my memory, with my rational thinking, with my sense of my own personal history. Are we somehow condemned to always be looking at that transcendent self from afar, wistfully, hoping to get there through some act of grace, because it's so far away. It has nothing to do with the life I live. I don't know about you, but I've been chanting on my beads now upwards of 52 years or whatever, right? And I struggle with it. I can't claim that it's given me some palpable, quantifiable sense of myself in eternity. It's still me here, little old me, the little old me that my mom used to call to lunch by, hey, Joshie, come, it's lunchtime, If anyone tried to call me Joshie today, I'd excommunicate them. But the point is, it's still that historic me whom I identify with. The rest of it seems very beautiful, but so how do you, can you offer any kind of encouragement or hope or, is there any, inducement that you can offer people that there is something to you that's more than the historic self, that it's not just theoretical?
What I'm describing, Joshua, is not a transcendent perspective. This is a perspective in time. It's a perspective in the moment. All I say is that faith does not rise and fall on the ability to date a sacred text to a particular time period or a particular era, or to be able to find archaeological evidence for a deity or for an event. That time, historical time as we understand, is not abstract, it's not transcendent, it's here. But it's recognizing the reality of the fact that everything in this world that we look around is moving in cycles. This is not a transcendent perspective. This is a perspective that's down to earth, that is lived by millions of people. When we look out into the ocean, the tides come and go in cycles. The seasons move in cycles. The calendar moves in circles. The sun moves like a clock in cycles over our head. Birth and death within a family take place in cycles. Our experiences and relationships go through cycles that we can view. And when we recognize that truth is something deeper than being able to just locate ourselves at a particular moment in that cycle, when we recognize that truth is something that lies below, a little bit deeper than that cycle that constantly rotates around us, that's what gives us hope that the rat race of this world is not all that there is, that we're not merely on a hamster wheel. So recognizing the cyclical nature of our world, to me, it gives hope in times of despair, because I recognize that just as joys are fleeting, we are reminded of that all the time, right? That our pleasures and joys and our happy moments don't last forever, but our pains are also fleeting. They too will pass in due course of time. And that both those pleasures and pains, they betray, they show us, they reveal a truth that's deeper, that's below that surface. And if we can hold on to that truth then the swirling waters around us in our world, which are constantly swirling, we can have some stability. We can have some wisdom through that. We can find our feet in this world, in the swirl of this world. So that's what I mean to convey from this understanding of time. It's not that we stand apart from it. No, we stand in that river of time. We feel the whirlpool around us, and yet we say, I can feel solid ground below me. And it's that truth, that sat, as it's called, that I want to hold on to, which I'm going to be able to find anywhere I am, any part of the world I'm in, any culture I encounter, it's there. And that's the Vedantic conviction. That's the Vedantic conviction that through all that multiplicity and through all that change, there is a place of stability. There is a place of consistency that we can go to. And that's what we seek on our beads, right? That's what we return to every day. This is why we keep at it for 52 years.
Huxley's ground of being, some solid foundation beneath the fluctuation. All right, thank you. That was a wonderful, brilliant answer. Really, really lovely. I see a couple of other questions. We have time for maybe one or two more, and then believe it or not, we're coming to the end of our time together here. Ananda Vilas asks, what's important, how we see the world or how the world sees us? Very pragmatic question.
Like a good Hindu, I want to break apart that dichotomy, and simply to say that, as hopefully was clear in the way I responded to your earlier question, Joshua, about what's so scary about the other, the two are inextricably connected, in that the way we see the world directly affects how the world sees us. When we go through the world with this ground of being that I described, people respond accordingly. They see you accordingly. They recognize that somehow this person stands in the eye of the storm. And I'm not sure what it is about this person that makes them a refuge, but I'm going to stand right next to them. And we all know such people, the gurus and teachers and sadhus and saints of the present day and of the past, perhaps members of our family, that bring a perspective into the world, that see the world in such a way that when we see them, we recognize that there is something different, there is something stable, there is something very protective about who they are. And I want to be right there. And so this is the idea of karma at its best, right? That what we put into the world, this is what we're going to get out of the world. This is not an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. That's karma in a very simplistic and very superficial sense. In a deeper sense, karma says, me and the world, we're inextricably connected. And the way I am in the world is going to be for me and respond to me in that way.
Oh, that's lovely. Really lovely. Boy, oh boy, what an amazing session this is. Okay, one last question. How would you define a bona fide path? I've heard that Buddhism is not a bona fide path because a bona fide path helps one develop love of God, and Buddhism, in the most traditional sense, does not. You teach Buddhism in your world religions class, and you mention you see God in all the faiths. There's a trick question for you. So can you comment if Buddhism is a bona fide path? All right, good luck with that one.
So there's actually two questions there. One is the more, the larger question of how do you recognize a path as having validity, of being bona fide, and the other particularly in regards to Buddhism. So let me say with Buddhism that there, number one, I think it can be easy to generalize about a tradition. And if you study something like Pure Land Buddhism, which is the dominant form of Buddhist practice across East Asia, you find elements of bhakti that are as deep as bhakti as that I know of in the Krishna bhakti traditions. Ways of departing this world in a way that is saturated with the name of God, the presence of God, surrounded by others in that same mode. I mean, this is something that if you look at Pure Land Buddhism and the way that's cultivated, a life of bhakti is cultivated, the way it culminates in those final moments, those final rites, I find it difficult not to see actual bhakti in the way that I recognize it, right? So I think it's we have to be careful in terms of generalizing about a particular tradition. Now, I recognize that there are forms of Buddhism that have a end goal that is very different than the goal that I aspire for. And the more severe forms of Buddhism that speak of an emptiness that has no persistence of the individual self or of anything divine. And in situations like that, I've really done a lot of study of arguments back and forth, the philosophical arguments of viewpoints that are personal and impersonal, that speak of persistence of the individual self, that don't speak of it. Those debates have been going on for thousands of years, and they're literally thousands of years. And the reason they have is because there's always a comeback. There's always another philosophical argument to attack the first, right? And this is why the Vedanta Sutra states very beautifully, Tarko Pratishthanat, that the absolute, the divine God cannot be established by reason and by logic, right? Brahman cannot be established merely by logic. Definitely reason and logic are a huge aid in terms of our understanding to the world. But that alone is not going to lead to a conclusion. And the history of, I think, interreligious philosophical debates makes that crystal clear. So the way I ask the question for myself, and this is not to others, but for my own practice, how do I find a tradition that I want to practice, is by asking simply the question, where do they lead? What is their vision of the endpoint, right? What kind of world are they trying to create? And for me, if a tradition is offering a vision of goodness, a vision of the ultimate that is personal, that is relational, that is saturated not just in truth, but in human emotions and connections and relationships, that is endlessly full of variety rather than only unity, that is the world that I want to end up in. That's the vision I want to pursue, right? So that's the path I'm going to walk or to follow. So that's what I would ask of myself and of others, is I often, when students come to me and say, I don't know which, I mean, the arguments look good in all directions. I was an undergraduate major in philosophy, and you study Plato and you think that's it, he's right. And then you study Aristotle and you're like, wait a minute, he's better. And then you study Descartes and he's even better. And everyone seems right so long as you're reading them. So when I ask that question of myself, when students ask them, I encourage them to ask this of themselves, is what kind of vision are they offering for the world? And if that's the world you want to live in, walk that path, and the philosophical argument will go on regardless.
I cannot begin to describe for you how satisfying this time with you has been this evening, and how grateful I am to you for having set aside the time to be with us. It's a real privilege to talk with you. You've given us a whole lot to think about, and I hope that you'll consider coming back and being our guest again sometime in the very near future. So on behalf of all of our guests here this evening, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your insight, for your very enlightening perspectives on some very tricky issues. And thank you as well to all of our guests for having done your best to trip up our guest and for having failed miserably. Try again next time. And I hope there will be a next time in our near future. Word will go out by our email from our fearless leader, Anuradha, who sends out the newsletters, and you'll be getting a schedule from us very soon for programs later in the year. Thank you again, one and all, for being with us for this absolutely memorable installment of Gita Wisdom. Have a wonderful evening. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Ravi, thank you. We so appreciate you. I want you to have my babies. Hare Krishna.
And on that note,
Thank you for listening to Gita Wisdom. For more information, please visit gitawisdom.org.